I said, hold up, if he's abusive, then, shouldn't we at least say something to the people who have been supporting us through all this? He's like, no, it's best not to hurt his ministry. This was one situation where he was just like, well, we just don't talk about it. I was like, that's weird. So that started getting more questions like ginned up in my head. And I started doing a bit of research online into the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. And I come to find out a lot of the people that I've been raised to consider heroes and to consider important people in the movement, they have been found out to have done some terrible things of a sexual nature, like a criminal embezzling type nature. And more often than not, their churches would attempt to cover it up. And I asked my dad about it. I said, this is not an isolated case. I'm like, this has been happening a lot. And he said, well, yes, but we don't know all the details of everything. And it's best not to talk about such things. And the straw that broke the camel's back was when all the allegations came out against Bill Gothard. And I confronted my dad about all that. I said, wait a minute. I said, even Bill Gothard, even my friends, he's like, we just can't talk about it. I'm like, you knew all this and you said nothing. And now I know this and I can't talk about it. I said, there's something desperately wrong here.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Prey vs. Predator. My name is Jill, and we are so happy to have Chad Harris as our guest today. You probably heard Chad's name before. He was a guest on the docuseries Shiny Happy People, and he had a lot to say there, and he's going to have a lot to say today. Wondering, Chad, should we start with you, or PJ? Would you want to ask the first question?
Well, let's start. Chad, we'd love to hear a little bit about you and who you are and how you got involved in, first, where we know you from, Shiny Happy People. Let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, once again, thank you for having me on. It is an honor to talk to all of you. I am Chad Harris. I was raised in the Institute in Basic Life Principles. I call it a cult because, frankly, it was. And I was raised in their homeschooling branch, the Advanced Training Institute, ATI, from the time I was about 7 or 8 years old until I graduated from high school. I'm the first fully homeschooled part of my family. I'm the fourth of 6 children. I grew up in an independent fundamental Baptist preacher's home. We were in Alabama for most of my childhood until I was 12. Then we moved to Belgium, where we were missionaries for 7 years. And I stuck with IBLP basically throughout that entire time. I learned a lot of things that I kind of internalized and self-directed my life through the principles, quote unquote, that the cult taught us. And it took me a long time to kind of deconstruct that. And when I first started, deconstruction wasn't even a term. So I started doing that in about my mid-20s, and I've been working ever since to kind of stand on my own feet, as it were, without the teachings of the cult to, guide me and to keep me under, the authorities that they tried to place over my life. I got involved with the documentary in 2020, late 2020. I started to tell my story on TikTok after my dad died in July of 2020. After talking with my therapist, she said, you have quite a story. She said it probably would help you to kind of get it out somehow, maybe write it down. And I said, well, every time I've tried to write it down, I tend to dissociate for a while, and it's not really good for me to do so. And she said, well, you like to perform. At the time I was performing improv comedy and such. And she said, you like to perform. Why not try to find a way to perform your story? I said, well, no one's going to listen to a middle-aged man complains about his life for an hour. That's called stand-up, and I do improv. but I got thinking, and also I'm like, it's 2022. Everything's still shut down. So I said, but there is an app that limits me to about 60 seconds a pop. If I tell my story that way, at least I won't go off on rabbit trails, and I have to stick to the story. So I started doing that. And I got a small following from that. And I met other people who became really good friends of mine through the app, most notably Cult Chronicles on TikTok, who you know as Lindsay Williams, and my good friend Heather Heath, who was also in the docuseries as Backslidden Harlot on TikTok as well. And we all got to know each other. And right about late 2020, I heard tell from one of the survivor groups that there were a couple of people who were looking for people to tell their stories of growing up IBLP for a potential documentary. That was Olivia Chris, the director of Shiny Happy People, and her production partner, Lauren Andrade. And we had a Zoom call, and I started telling my story. And we had a 2-hour conversation that was one of the most empathetic, one of the kindest, one of the most active listening experiences I've had in telling my story of growing up IBLP. At one point, both Olivia and Lauren started crying, and I didn't even realize that, that particular part of my story was sad. And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you do that." And they're like, "Oh no," they're like, "Keep going." So eventually, the docuseries got picked up by Amazon shortly after the sentencing of Josh Duggar, and they asked people to come down for in-person interviews in Savannah, Georgia. I drove down, and what you see as a result is what eventually became my small contribution to Shiny Happy People. So I was honored to be a part of it, and I really hope that it plays a huge role in taking down IBLP once and for all.
Awesome.
Thank you for being brave enough to do it as well, because I think all of the people on it who speak into that life or growing up that way, we need to honor the contribution and the bravery that it takes to speak out, especially in these predatorial situations or social structures that are created in these organizations. Is there a way you can I know in the documentary we really don't get to know your story. We have pockets of your story, but can you tell your story to us?
Sure. So to get started where my family started in homeschooling, we have to go back to before I was born. My parents had been missionaries to the Netherlands and Belgium back in the late 70s and early 80s. My dad took my older 3 siblings out of school over there because he disagreed with a few of their practices, namely involving, their relaxed standards on nudity when they were changing in the locker room and stuff like that. And the Dutch government jokingly told my dad, "Well, why don't you teach your kids at home if you're that worried about it?" He said, "Okay." So he took my older sisters and older brother out of school there. They started homeschooling then. But eventually, my dad started losing his hearing. So he moved to England and started a military church over there so that, he didn't have to deal with losing his hearing while learning a foreign language. Well, that's where I was born. And when I was about 10 months old, we moved back to Alabama completely because my dad's hearing loss just kept getting worse. So I started out in Walker County, Alabama, where most of my family is from. My dad started a small church there, and at that point, my older sisters had already graduated, and he put my older brother in a Christian school. But he and mom had determined that when I came of age to start going to school, they were going to start homeschooling me from the get-go. So, because they just figured that it might be just better overall, and they would prefer that. My older brother went to school to kind of get reacclimated to the States, but they wanted to see how I would do just completely homeschooled from start to finish, which presented a bit of a problem because my older brother was 10 years older than I was, and we didn't have a lot of money, my dad being a pastor of a small church. So they needed to find a curriculum that worked for both of us. Also at this time, my mom was entering her 40s. And as I said, I was born 10 years after my older brother. So I very clearly was not planned. And my folks let me know that at every possible opportunity. So they started talking to an OBGYN who was a Christian. That was always a prerequisite of my family's. Every doctor had to be a Christian. And they talked to him about, we don't want any more children, but we don't want to take any drastic measures like surgery or anything. So, how can we deal with all this? And he said, well, and knowing, my mom and dad's background, he said, well, you're both very committed Christians and you've given a lot over to God. Why not give over the number of children that you have to God? So he gave my mom a copy of a book called A Full Quiver, which is the basic manifesto, basically, of the Quiverful movement. And my parents ate it up and decided, yes, this is the route they wanted to take. They wanted to have as many kids as God would give them, and they just stopped taking any precautions from there. They had 2 more children after me as a result. Well, also about this time, while they were looking for a homeschooling curriculum, the same doctor talked my folks into, going along with this seminar that was being held in town by one Bill Gothard. And that's where they learned about the Advanced Training Institute homeschooling curriculum, which Bill Gothard sold as something the entire family could do no matter what their age. So this was a curriculum that would work for my older brother and myself. They pulled my older brother out of Christian school. They felt he had acclimated enough. And they taught him the same curriculum that they were teaching me with the Advanced Training Institute homeschool curriculum from IBLP.
So a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old doing the same stuff.
Well, at that point, about 7 or 8 year old and 16, 17-year-old as my older brother. So yeah, they basically taught that, the Sermon on the Mount was timeless and it could work for anyone. And you could adapt whatever the wisdom booklet curriculum that we had, you could adapt it to any age, which was complete and utter nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
So you are 7 or 8 years old. Your family's living in Alabama. You are starting on this curriculum that somehow magically fits for a 7, 8-year-old and a 16-year-old, which is impressive. And we're gonna let that be and not go down that rabbit hole right now, I hope. What do you remember about that time as a young boy? Did it change the tone and mood of your family? Was there a difference? And if so, tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, there definitely was. As a small child, I was allowed to watch a bit more TV. It was still, in a fundamentalist family, it was still very heavily regulated. But we would watch things like, Full House, Family Matters on Friday nights. When it would come on, late 80s, early 90s type TV fare. And I was allowed to watch a lot of public television here in the States, and also some cartoons like, some of the regular Disney things that would come on in the afternoon. And my parents really didn't see that much of a problem with it. But after we joined up with ATI and we got accepted into the program, one of the prerequisites was that we had to, disclose whether or not we had a TV in the house and what we were using it for. So a lot of the TV just got cut off completely. Well, I don't think we ever fully got rid of the TV so much as we just hooked up a VCR to it, took down the antenna, and we just watched a lot of VHS tapes, which, like I said in the documentary, were typically only things that were approved by ATI or my parents under some very strict scrutiny. So a lot of that started getting tamped down. Everything that we played with or everything that we watched or anything was screened for demons. There was a lot of fear in ATI and IBLP about items that could be considered demonic. Very famously, Cabbage Patch Kids were considered to be inherently demonic, as we covered in the docuseries. But there were other things like Calvin and Hobbes comics in the Sunday paper. I used to be a huge fan of that growing up, but there was one sermon by an IBLP related pastor, I cannot remember who, but he preached with a very fiery tone of voice that Calvin and Hobbes is demonic because, the Hobbes character, for those unfamiliar with the comic, it's about a little boy and his stuffed tiger who he imagines is real. And the tiger is only shown as real when the parents aren't around. So therefore, that is a demon that was being sent to subvert Calvin's parents' authority. So my parents would actually take paper and staple it over the comic strip in the paper so I couldn't read it. They would write on it in big Sharpie, "Do not read, Chad." Yeah. So so things like that, everything became more and more controlled. Eventually, my parents did away, since my dad was the pastor of the church that we attended, we did away with the idea of Sunday school separated by age. And each family was expected to teach, the fathers were expected to teach their own kids and maybe gather together in family groups and teach everyone in their group the same Sunday school lesson in the auditorium, because separating things by age was a worldly invention. And much like we did in ATI, where all the kids learn from the same curriculum, we expanded that to the church as well. So yeah, we started adapting the spirit of a lot of what IBLP and ATI tried to put forth, which was, their weird, isolated way of doing things. Keep all influences that are considered worldly out and gather into your little huddles and everything. And and pretend like this is the more godly way to do stuff.
Did you ever question it as a child? Like, did you feel, was it confusing? Like the things that you liked, you can't look at anymore or are deemed bad? Or was it like, okay, this is how it is?
I mean, I questioned it, but not out loud, because that was a good way to be physically abused, which as I mentioned, several places, I was introduced to complete strangers to the family as the kid we beat the most. I was considered to be quote unquote strong-willed, and my parents told me over and over that their goal was to break my will so that I could be obedient and compliant to what they were teaching me. Anything other than first-time obedience was considered rebellion, which, according to the Bible, is worse than the sin of witchcraft, as they like to say. So I did question it inside. I was like, well, what's wrong with, Calvin and Hobbes? Like, I know it's not real. I'm 7 or 8 years old, but I know the difference of what they're trying to portray. But I didn't dare question it, because if I did, I would be, hit until I couldn't register a response. So I just learned to kind of like keep that to myself. And if I liked something, I learned not to like it too much, because my parents would take my liking something or being a fan of something as an indication that if it's popular, it's probably sent by the devil. So they would find something wrong with it if I like something too much.
I mean, it sounds, when you're describing it, there sounds like, is it too far to say it sounds like a sadistic kind of overtone? Like, oh, you like it, I'm going to use it as a weapon against you.
I mean, I would say that's fair to say. It almost felt like it was a game to mom and dad. I would hear them late at night talking to my older brother, because he was the golden child in our family. They would talk to him about, different, like, say, innocent videos that they had approved and everything. And they would review them and say, well, this could be bad because potentially, this looks like someone's drinking in the background or something, or, stuff like that. It was like almost a game. My dad actually preached in his church that the character of Barney, like the purple dinosaur Barney, was demonic because of the whole Calvin and Hobbes thing. He only became real when the kids were at their little daycare or whatever, and the parents weren't around. So, they would find different ways to like extrapolate that, and nobody in the church was allowed to have Barney stuff in their house, which is kind of funny, because the producer Barney actually became a huge funder of VeggieTales later. So I don't know what that tells you, but it was just things like that. It almost seemed like a game to them. And to me, it was scaring me to death, because I didn't know what was going to be thrown out, or what I was allowed to like or not like, or what was going to get me beat next. So, there was always a sense of fear anytime I had an interest in anything.
It is interesting that you say like you didn't know where things would come from, because we have talked in previous episodes about, in our dynamic, we prey and predators, like the people that want to control us, use coercive control, and that's what we would call this system as a predatory system. And the people who are like open-minded and sensitive and loving, those are prey, and we're all proud to be prey. But there is a sense of confusion, and often in these relationships with the predator and the prey, that you just don't know. And I know for myself, because I did have a predatory parent as well, that it was like, half the time I spent confused. Like one day it was okay and the next day it's not. And that sense of confusion is a really good signal something's wrong. But you're just confused as a child. You don't know how to address it. But I think it's a good symptom of this system and how unhealthy it is, essentially.
Well, and in addition to all of that, you have my mother, who I mentioned on the docuseries, was really the primary abuser in our family, because my dad was abusive, but there were times where he would show restraint. My mom showed none. Like when she would go off on her rants, like nobody was safe. She would just start hitting things indiscriminately. She would start screaming. She would go off on hours long rants about, how we were going to hell and such, or the government was going to come and take us away from, the house, and we would all be put in foster homes and drugged out of our mind in public school, which was the narrative that she would put forth. And my dad would try to justify that to us by taking us aside after she would go off on one of her long rants and say, look, your mother's going through changes right now. Every woman goes through them. And, you have to be very careful with her because she could potentially go insane if you misbehave. Like that was
if you misbehave. Wow.
The children. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he would tell us that. And I mean, by just for how long it went on, I mean, I figure that my mom went through menopause for 15 years, but that was literally like how he would, try to keep us from, setting her off. And, we had to walk on eggshells around her because it was impossible to predict what normal behavior would set her off this day.
So it was your responsibility. Okay, it was your responsibility as an 8-year-old to not upset your adult mother. And if you did, again, this is where the prey is responsible for the predator's behavior, right? And all this, and the system supports it.
Or like my counselor would say in later years, who exactly was parenting in this family?
Yeah, totally. You're having to modify who you are, what you say, how you say it, what you like, what you don't like. You're self-policing every step of the way in order not to set off a ticking time bomb. And no doubt the ticking time bomb would get set off even despite the fact that you were doing everything you could not to set it off. And then it would be your fault, it sounds like.
Yep, absolutely. And it was so if I had to describe like the overarching feeling that I had in my childhood, it was fear. Absolutely.
Which is, you had said this is a cult, and it's interesting because there's that fear is the number one first priority for a cult, right? Like that's the first thing you look for. Is there a culture of fear? So check that box, yeah. And then the isolation, you can't have any outside resources. So we checked that box. And then we got punishment, right?
Well, and fear breeds these perfectly lined up children, these quiet children who don't interrupt. It's like when you watch the Duggar documentary, you see, at one point I was rewatching it for this interview, and it reminded me like of those communist videos of people lined up like in South Korea or whatever. And I was like, that's what it looks like to me. But it's these children. It's children who should be playing and having fun, but it's these well-behaved children, probably because fear is such an implement of keeping them in line, literal lines.
This might be going on a rabbit trail here, but you just said something that made me wonder because, Chad, you were talking about being as an adult, quite funny, and we're seeing here you've got this ability to have fun and to play. And we were talking to Tia Leving yesterday, and we're talking about, does this type of environment stop your play? Like if you were a playful kid, a funny kid, a joyful kid, did it end that for you, or did it take it away?
Wouldn't say it took it away completely. It just made me very careful as to where to be that.
Okay.
Like I got really good at reading, when I was being listened to or when I was being monitored. I was always like looking over my shoulder, even if I was playing outside, which happened quite a bit because, I was never one of those quiet children. And there would be just times that mom would just tell me, go play outside. We were in the middle of nowhere. So, I could just go out and, without too much trouble, go play on the swing set or go study ants in the ant bed, which was weirdly one of my favorite hobbies as a kid. But yeah, I would go out and I would like make up these fantasies and make up, these little play times for myself. I didn't really have a playmate to speak of. My younger siblings were always too young for me to really interact with. So I would just go out and play on my own, but I was always cautious because I wasn't allowed to have imaginary friends because those could be demons.
Right.
So even if I was like using my imagination to create a scenario, I was always looking around, making sure my older brother wasn't listening, because the one thing he loved to do was snitch. Like if I was doing anything remotely not allowed, he would be the first to go to mom and dad for it, or even administer the physical punishment himself, because he was an older sibling and they were allowed to do that in IBLD. So yeah. And so I just had to be very careful as to how to express that as a kid, how to be playful, how to be funny. And I used to read joke books, and probably my earliest, since I couldn't do Calvin and Hobbes, one of my earliest comedic influences was the Peanuts comics. I had, like book upon book of Charlie Brown comics. I used to love those. I kind of felt like Charlie Brown was a bit relatable because, he apparently couldn't do anything right either. But yeah, I would cherish that stuff. But I would keep it away from my folks' awareness, or at least try to, because I knew the minute they saw me having too much fun, then all my behavior was under, a lot of skeptical view, like a microscope almost.
Was there a point when you sort of said, oh, this isn't right? Or did that come much later?
Yeah, it came much later because I was so isolated. And keep in mind, when I was 12, we moved to Europe, and I really didn't have a peer group at that point. Like, we lived, but there's no other independent fundamental Baptist in Belgium, frankly. There was one other family, and they lived an hour away from us. There were 2 ATI families. One was a Canadian one that lived a little ways away, and then there was one that lived 2 hours away. And so we would get together regularly and meet once a month, but we didn't have daily contact with other people. So basically, at that point, I was the oldest kid in the family, and my younger siblings are still way younger than me. So I basically was on my own. I didn't know anything outside of what I was being raised to learn.
This was normal.
Yeah, this was normal. And I just figured that, pretty much every other fundamentalist kid, I was aware that other kids did different things, but they were worldly and we didn't care about that. They might as well have not existed. That's not what we're here for. I lived in Belgium for 7 years, and I saw everyone around me like a project and not a person. That's the thing. I would see kids riding their bikes to school every day and such. And of course, my parents would be like, aren't you glad you don't have to do that? They're going off to learn, communist stuff and everything. You're staying here, and we're going to win them for Christ. And, we were trying to change everyone around us. So, you go over there, and I'm in this culture. I could be learning all these things. I did learn the language, thankfully, but I could have learned so much about the world outside of what I was raised in. And I couldn't do it because I was self-policing to believe that these were the people who were wrong and we were doing things the right way.
Right. So, you had nothing to learn because you had the capital T truth, and you had certainty and superiority on your side. So what else is there really in life? That reminds me in the documentary where the Gothard talks about, there's all these questions. If you want a better marriage, if you want, perfect children, he doesn't frame it that way. If you want, freedom from addiction, we have, and it literally says, we have all the answers, for your entire life. And it's just so terrifying. This idea, we have capital T truth. So we don't need to grow or learn at all. We just need to reinforce what we already know and then share it with other people.
Or not share it, tell other people that they're doing it wrong and make sure that they're not going to hell.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So you're growing up in this, and you're there's a part of you, it sounds like you're almost keeping private. You're having the sense that this is a world that you're enjoying by yourself. Don't let anybody see it. And so you're protecting it, but yet there's also that side of there is nothing else. This is how things are. When did that change? How did you get to where you are?
So that was that was basically getting mugged by reality because I came back to the States when I was about 19. My parents moved back over as well. My dad took a position with the mission that we were with, and they needed a minister of music for the church that ran the mission out in Mississippi. And I said, well, yeah, sure, I'll go do that, because I did study some music theory while I was in Europe. That was a thing I was allowed to do. So I became minister of music out there. And minister of music, it sounds very prestigious, but it essentially was just me waving my arm at a hymn book on Sundays while whoever piano
Keeping
player volunteered for that day. Exactly.
Yeah.
4/4 time. We have some 6/8. I can go a little crazy.
6/8. Okay. Wow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes.
So I would just swing my arm and keep everybody on track. And I was allowed free room and board for doing that, but I had to sustain myself elsewhere. So I had a day job as a computer tech, which that in and of itself, taught me a whole lot about interacting with the general public. And I'll never forget the first time I had to make a house call for a young woman who lived alone. And, I grew up with the Billy Graham rule. I was like, I was told like, this is your call. You need to go do it. And I was like, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable doing that. They're like, you're going to go over there, fix the computer and be professional about it is what you're going to do. I was like, okay.
What did you think would happen? Like she would jump your bones? I don't know. Like, I don't know.
That or claim I did or something.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen here. So
Fear.
Fear.
Yeah. So, right. So it was fear. But I went and I fixed the computer and everything turned out fine. And I was just like, oh.
Like lightning didn't strike? Like
No, I wasn't, and I was worried about my church finding out about it too, because I figured that, if anyone found out in the church that I had, gone to someone's house and everything, even in a professional manner, then, I would be disciplined for it because that church loved their church discipline. Mm-hmm. But, that was like an intro for me to kind of learn how to interact with people who didn't believe as I did and, actually do real world things that were not church related. And then I found out that the pastor of that particular church, his wife, about a year into me working there, left and sued him for emotional abuse.
Oh,
like it hit the paper and everything locally. So he had to resign and we were without a pastor. My dad, of course, was attending at the church at the same time. So, he kind of stepped into a leadership role to help find a new pastor. And it's a long story how it happened, but eventually the pastor and his wife reconciled, even though it turns out this is the second time this had happened in their marriage. And he became pastor again as if nothing had ever happened. And that was my first thought. I was like, something is not right about any of this. I said, people just don't do that. You don't just like, you don't have this horrible thing happen and then a month later is as if nothing ever happened and you go back to your old life. Like I feel like there's some stuff that needs to be worked out here, but I was blamed for causing dissension and everything, so I resigned and I came back to Alabama.
So you were caused dissension because
you asked a question.
You actually asked the question.
Yeah.
Oh, so what question did you ask?
I was like, hey, do we think this guy's still qualified to be a pastor here?
Oh.
I was like, it was in the paper and everything. Like, what happened?
So, she was emotionally abused and it was in the paper. And they were saying, oh, it didn't happen, welcome back, or that they fixed it. He fixed it and he welcome back.
He fixed it and he got welcome back.
Yeah. Okay.
Even though this is the second time it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And you asking the question. Did you get yourself in trouble asking questions before?
Not really.
No.
Because I learned to keep my mouth shut a lot.
So did this reinforce? So you finally, like these questions that have been, you've held in, you finally actually asked this question and then you end up losing your position. Did that sort of reinforce this belief to not ask questions?
Not really.
No. Okay.
Because one thing that really struck me as odd about the entire situation was, as I said, my dad attended the same church. He worked for them as well. He resigned as well because he frankly agreed with me. He was like, yeah, there's something definitely wrong here. But after he came back in, he told me, well, we tried to do the right thing. It didn't work. So it's best not to talk about it because we could hurt his ministry moving forward. I said, hold up. If he's abusive, then, shouldn't we at least say something to the people who have been supporting us through all this? He's like, no, it's best not to hurt his ministry. My dad, early on in his own ministry as a pastor, he had been kicked out of one seminary for asking questions about the faculty. He had been kicked out of another fundamentalist college for questioning the president of a college there.
Wow.
And I had seen him speak out against, some of not in our denomination, but other pastors and everything and other leaders in the area. I had seen him speak from the pulpit about that. But this was one situation where he was just like, well, we just don't talk about it. I was like, that's weird. So that started getting more questions ginned up in my head. And I started like doing a bit of research online into the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church.
Oh.
And I come to find out a lot of the people that I've been raised to consider heroes and to consider important people in the movement, they have been found out to have done some terrible things of a sexual nature, of like a criminal embezzling type nature.
Wow.
And more often than not, people would, their churches would attempt to cover it up and like send them elsewhere to another church or what have you. And I was like, wait a minute, because I kept finding story after story of this. And I asked my dad about it. I said, this is not an isolated case. I'm like, this has been happening a lot. And he said, well, yes, but we don't know all the details of everything. And it's best not to talk about such things. I was like, but you didn't start out this way. I said, very famously, you ask a lot of questions and all of a sudden now we can't. What's wrong here? And the straw that broke the camel's back was when all the allegations came out against Bill Gothard on Recovering Grace.
Yeah.
And when I found out about that, which incidentally also went along with me finding out that a lot of my friends and people I grew up with here in Alabama, while I'd been away, had been abused and worse here in the Birmingham area. I found out all that had been happening, and I confronted my dad about all that. I said, wait a minute. I said, even Bill Gothard, even my friends who I wasn't told the truth about why all of a sudden we couldn't talk to them anymore or why they kind of disappeared. And he was like, well, he's like, we just can't talk about it. I'm like, I'm done watching people like, first of all, the fact that you knew really bothers me. Like you knew all this and you said nothing. Yeah. And now I know this and I can't talk about it. I said, there's something desperately wrong here.
It is interesting that your dad seems to have the same thing you had, which is asking the questions, but he got that tampered down and shut. And he let that go. Maybe that part of him that maybe asked those questions, or he bought the party line. Do you have a reason why? Like he drank the Kool-Aid? Who knows? All the metaphors we want to use. But do you think there's a reason why he stopped asking questions?
It took me years to talk to him about it because he absolutely would not discuss it when mom was around. And getting him away from mom was a chore. But there was one time I was able to get him alone. One of the last times, actually probably the last time we spent alone together. We were fishing. And of his own free will, I didn't even prod him on this. He said, look, son, he said, I saw people do a lot of things in the church that they probably should have gone to jail for. But it wasn't my place to speak of. And I said, Dad, you're a preacher. Whose place was it? I said, the IFB, the Independent Fundamental Baptist denomination, is really more of just a catch-all phrase. There is no central organization to it. There is no hierarchy other than what everybody is just arbitrarily made up. Like there is no people who are more qualified to speak out than others. Like any preacher can say anything. And I'm like, who's higher than your job? Like other than, allegedly God. I was like, why wasn't it your place to speak out? You've spoken out before. Why all of a sudden when it was your friends, you didn't say anything? And he didn't have an answer to that. And that was about the point where I said, I'm done hurting people. I'm like, I can't stand by and watch people get hurt. That's not what I signed up for. And I just can't be part of this. And also about that time I started going to therapy. And that was when my counselor told me like, hey, what you grew up in isn't great. Like, have you ever heard of a high controlling environment? I was like, no. And she said, what you're exhibiting, like I was having panic attacks and I was, very heavily depressed at that point. And she said, a lot of your symptoms from what you're telling me has to do is something I see very often with people who grew up in high controlling environments. She said, I don't know a whole lot about this IBLP, but she said, I've seen people in your situation before. And she sat down and showed me the facts, of like everything that I could expect to see from this. I'm like, yep, got that. Okay, I'm doing something wrong. How do I change? So yeah, at that point, because I was done living like that. I was done living in fear. Yeah. I was done living with the physical symptoms of, having grown up and all that. And I was like, obviously what I'm doing isn't working. What needs to happen?
Okay, this seems like the perfect place
Yes.
for us to pause here
Yes.
because what I would love to hear you speak to, if you be so willing to so kind as to be willing to come back and join us for a second episode, is I would love to hear you speak on, we talk about prey and predator, and a lot of times people have this assumption that prey are women and predators are men, and this is just so not true. And as you're talking about your dad, who is sort of in some ways in a predatory position, which what I mean is like a position of power in a predatory system, and yet he kind of seems more like prey. And then you're coming to him saying like, why didn't you? And so could we explore a little bit, like for you, what is that like? Because you don't want to hurt people, but you're in a system where, hey, you could have lots of power. And then, dad's nature sounds like mom was more of the predator, and dad's trying to make everything okay, just make it okay. So there's these things we do to tell ourselves, and it sounds like he had that sort of structure. Would you be willing to come and talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Excellent.
we would love that.
Chad, this is so good.
Oh,
How do
so
people
good.
find you online or social media?
Anytime you see Arch Radish, it's probably me, and it's no secret. Arch Radish is just Chad Harris mixed up. I figured this out when I was a teenager. I've used it ever since online. I'm on TikTok. I'm on Instagram. You can find me poking around on Reddit from time to time. Just anywhere you see Arch Radish, I'll be out there.
Perfect.
Mostly on TikTok, though.
We'll look for it.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Thank you,
Chad.
Chad.
Come back
Thank
for
you.
part 2.